I think I'm going to build a squad of Warhammer figures. Gaunt's Ghosts. It only took a couple of hours to build the entire squad, and on 4 of them, I glued them fully together, and I'm going to paint them as they are. 2 of them, this one and this one, I've left the cloaks unglued so that it'll make painting just a little bit easier. A few of the figures needed some seam filling, so I used some Vallejo plastic putty to fill those in, and then once they were filled in, I just used a damp cotton bud to clean up any of the excess. It does a good job of getting those filled in. I also wanted to drill out the gun barrels, so I just used this little pin vise to go around all the figures and make sure the gun barrels were drilled out and looked good. And then I began the basing, putting on some thick mud from Vallejo just to give everything a muddy, dirty look to the base. After priming everything in black, I started off painting the flesh tones. Normally I'd use Bugman's Glow for this from Citadel, but I actually grabbed the wrong paint off the shelf and didn't discover it until I had painted the entire squad. The difference isn't too great, so I wasn't too worried about it. I think it'll work out fine in the end. At least that's what I'm hoping. For the uniforms, instead of going with the Canon black color, I went with a slightly darker gray instead of pure black. I thought this would just give me some room to do some highlights and some shadows, and I also know that just black uniforms never stay black. Once they're washed a few times and worn a few times, they tend to fade a little bit, so I wanted to go for a little more of a realistic look on those. For the boots, I went with black gray just to give a little difference from the uniforms. This is going to be highlighted slightly differently to try and look a little different from the rest of the clothing. It's hard when you're using these dark colors to keep all the textures looking a little different for everything. By far the majority of the models that you have to paint are these cloaks. I decided on the inside of the cloaks to paint it a very dark version of what the exterior of the cloak is going to be, just so that I can leave it this single color and not have to paint in camo patterns, and it'll just look more shadowed, just basically to make it a little easier for painting. Most examples I've seen paint the inside and the outside the same, but I got a little lazy here. For the Colonel's jacket, I used a slightly dark blue just to differentiate that from the rest of the uniform, make it look a little bit different. I plan to highlight this just slightly different, although in the end it's all going to just essentially look like everything is kind of some shade of black or dark gray, but I thought maybe this would give it a little bit of a difference. For the various belts and pouches and straps around all of the squad, I used a leather brown color, and I'm going for a little lighter look here. Quite often I use a darker brown to start off as the base for my leather, but I'm going to go with a lighter color here just so there's some contrast with the rest of the dark clothing, and then if I need to darken it up later on, I can do that easily. Now for the exterior of the cloaks, I went with the Canon Death World Forest from Citadel, and I put this on in several thin coats. If it was a little patchy, I didn't mind. This is going to be a camouflage cloak, so if there's a little inconsistency in the base layers, that's fine. It'll just look, hopefully, like some kind of fabric or other material that this would be made of, so that it'll just give it a bit of a patchy appearance. For the large metallic parts of a few of the guns, I used a very metallic blue, darkened down just a little bit with some sea blue. I wanted this to have just a heavy steel look. I could have gone in with either a black color or a more traditional silverish metallic color, but I thought this kind of blue heavy steel look would be a good basis for the colors to come and would just make it look a little different. All of the scabbards on the model need to be painted red for all the squad members, so I based this with a darker red just to give it a little bit of depth that I can later go and highlight. And the colonel has quite a few red adornments on his uniform. There's some on his hat. He has a sash. He has some really cool pirate-looking cuffs that need to be painted red. So there's quite a lot on him to base, and I use this same red color for that basing. I used a lead belcher for many of the silver details. There are actually quite a few silver details across the squad. So anything that would be metallic, even if I'm going to shift it later on to another metallic color, I use this lead belcher to make sure that I got that in there. Everybody has a knife, so those needed to be painted in, and there's buckles on boots that needed to be painted, and portions of weapons and sections of the scabbards. So when you're painting this, look all around the models. It took me quite a few passes to make sure that I got everything. For the hair, I used some of the leather color that I'd already used and a sea blue color. I just thought this gave it a dark color that kind of looked like dark hair but wasn't just pure black. So there's quite a bit to paint on there. And then I used a slightly different green for the camouflage wrapping on the sniper rifle. I wanted it to be a distinct from what the cloaks are, but not too far different to be out of the realm of possibility for that piece of painting. And then the wooden stocks on the model, I gave it this light coating of old wood, and then I'll go back later and do additional treatments. With that color applied, all of the base colors are on all of the models. It took about 8 hours of work to get it to this point, so it wasn't as quick as it looks like in the video, but I'm pretty happy with how the base colors have turned out. To begin the highlighting, I started on the uniform, and I started with the original base color, and I just worked in some lighter gray blue in varying stages. And I started off with, I'm not even sure what the precise ratio was. I just mixed it on my wet palette and began painting in most of the areas that I had laid that base color in. I wanted the base color to be the shadow. And then I just progressively began painting smaller and smaller areas, in a few cases stippling on some color here and there, but just trying to bring out those highlights and give just some shape and some texture to the uniform. I finally worked my way up to the light color, the pure light color, and I focused this mainly on the tops of the creases, and I also, in areas that would receive more light, I put in a little extra color there. Just did a little stippling and painting and things like that. I didn't want it to be too bright because I wanted it to retain the look of cloth and not look like some kind of metallic color. But I thought this gave the uniform a fairly distinct look, and hopefully it looks like faded black rather than something that's just blue-gray. That's what I was going for, as a faded black uniform. I did the same process with the boots, starting again with the base color, and this time I just went right to a very light sky gray color, but mixed it in my wet palette very slowly in stages, putting on the highlights. And again, I wanted it to be fairly subtle, but I wanted to keep some distinction between these boots and the pants. But as I applied the highlights, I wasn't really happy with how they looked. It began to read less like leather and more like just another part of the uniform. It didn't have any distinction to it, and more importantly, it didn't read as black. It more and more was just reading as lots and lots of shades of gray, and that's not what I wanted. So I added a glaze over the top of this, just with pure flat black. And it was a very thin glaze, but what that did was it allowed the highlights that I had already painted in to still show through, but it shifted the color much more towards black and gave it a very distinct look from the rest of the uniform. And that ended up looking exactly like I had wanted to, so that was something to tuck away in my brain of thinking for later on. I think if I did it again, I would actually put more highlights in and then glaze over to bring it back to reading a little more black. The next thing I needed to do was paint the flesh, and this is something that has always been difficult for me. I started off with the base color and adding in a lighter flesh color. And what I wanted to do to try and get a gradient was just gradually mix in that lighter Cadian flesh tone into the darker color. And instead of just doing it in 2 or 3 steps, I probably put in 5 or 6 transitions of color for this, trying to slowly build that up. And it looked okay. So my thinking at this point was, well, I'm doing a little better than normal, so let me just keep proceeding on this, and then the others will get better. But like the focus on the camera right now, that isn't the way it worked out. And the longer I went, the more figures I painted, the worse it just seemed to get. I have a great amount of difficulty, it seems, to get these nice gradients in. The pants were okay, the boots were okay. It was the same concept, but it just wasn't working out. So by about the 3rd or 4th figure, I got so frustrated that I said, you know what, I just need to get this done and move on. So I overpainted the flesh areas with Cadian flesh tone, just completely overpainted them. And then I went in with some a lighter color, Citadel Kislev flesh, and just put in just a few simple basic highlights to try and bring out the details a little bit with that. Now I'll admit this was due to frustration. I'm not giving up on painting flesh tones, but I said I just gotta start moving things along. So let me fall back on what I know. It doesn't look as good, but it works. And then finally, I put in some Citadel contrast paint, some Guilliman flesh, to just bring in some shadow and some more detail. No, it's not a perfect solution, and I may go back somewhere in this process and paint in a few more highlights and try and make them look a little better. But I had to move on to get past the frustration and say, okay, there's other things on here that need to be painted too. So let me just take this temporary step and keep moving on. There's going to be more figures in the future, and painting flesh is something that takes time and practice. So I had to remind myself of those things and just be willing to accept a less than optimal solution for this set of figures. And it really bugged me to admit that, but that's what I think it was the best thing to do, so I could continue moving on with the project. I wanted to add some additional colors to the red areas, starting with the scabbards. And this is just layered up in a couple of additional colors. I imagine the scabbard being some kind of hard material, not something with a lot of texture. And of course also I had to get the Colonel's sash. That's really a prominent red feature, so I wanted to paint that. And this was a lot of fun to paint. After having the difficulties I did with the skin tones, this was actually a lot of fun to paint. Why I felt comfortable and felt successful in painting this and not the flesh tones, I have no idea. But the same method was used. I like the cap there, so I made sure to get the red on the hat so that it really stood out. And then I went for a brighter highlight on the scabbards. And again, I didn't see this as something that was metallic or shiny, but some kind of hard material that had just been painted. So I didn't want to go too bright with it. But when it came to the sash for the Colonel, again, I went with another round of highlights, this time pulling them back just a little bit to make those peaks and all of the texture a little brighter. I wanted this to be not a rough looking material, but a fairly smooth but bright material. So I didn't do any kind of stippling or anything like that. I pulled the highlight a little higher up on the peak of the hat. I didn't go all the way around with it, but let that previous color stand as it had been before. And of course, these cuffs are really fun to paint. I did a little edge highlighting here, as well as painting the highlights along the wrinkles to get those punched up a bit. And then finally, I wanted to do one more round of highlights just on the sash and the other red areas on the kernel. And I just used this bright red very much at the peak of the cap and on the very tops of the creases and things like that to just really make them stand out. For the capes, I started by adding in a Citadel shade, a Thonian camo shade, and this is just to deepen the shadows a little bit. Originally, I had not intended to use any shades on these, but after a few tests of painting, I thought it would help to just deepen the shadows. So I didn't do an overall application, but just right down into the areas of the deepest folds and the deepest recesses, and just kind of getting underneath things to help bring those shadows along. And then I used some of the base color to just clean up any of that shade that got out of sorts, just to neaten it up a bit and bring it back to a sort of neutral look. And I went in with a lighter green over the base color, and this is just to bring out the highlights, to bring out the folds in the fabric, to make them stand out. You've seen when a cape or something like that, any kind of fabric is wrinkled like that, the light is going to catch it in different ways. So I was just trying to simulate that there. And then I went in with an even lighter shade of green that worked with the base color and just highlighted the edges, right at the edges of the folds, just really trying to give it some depth so there would be some contrast. I was okay if the appearance was a little scratchy because this is a cloth material, I'm assuming, not something that is plastic or something like that. For the camouflage, I decided to put this over the various highlighting that I had done because I didn't see a good way to do it otherwise. So I used actually some greens, some browns, and some blacks that reminded me of the camouflage colors that were on the vehicles and things that I used when I was in the Army. So this is kind of a nod to my own military history here, to just give it maybe a sense of realism, but more a little bit of nostalgia for me. But I just did each of those three colors in little groups, just stippling the paint on there to get it looking like some kind of camouflage. The trouble I ran into was not doing it in patterns. I had trouble thinking randomly. And so I had to be very careful not to line it up too much, and on a couple of them I failed. But the next thing I wanted to do was to put some shade back over it, or a contrast paint rather, back over it to try and blend all of this together. And I mixed it with some glaze medium so that I could control the color and how much of it was on there. And I put this on in several layers on the various cloaks, just because I wanted to kind of eyeball it and see what I liked. So I could put it on the cloaks, go do the others, and then come back to that one. I used a very brown, a kind of a bright reddish brown for the ground. I want this to appear as swampy ground. That's what I want to try and sell in the end. Now, there's going to be additional applications of products that go over this, but I wanted for the base something that was very much looking like wet, muddy earth and not something dry. For the trees, I mixed that same brown color, but I mixed it with some neutral gray. And I based this on just going out in my yard. I went and everything I've seen generally paints trees as brown, but I went out and looked at the trees in my yard, various varieties, looked at them close and realized they're more gray than they are brown. So I mixed a little bit of that earth color in with neutral gray, and I liked the base that provided for the tree. Now, again, there's going to be additional effects and colors that go over this, but I just thought this would be a really good base that would help sell the notion that this is an old piece of wood sitting in a swamp somewhere. Now, for these tufts of grass that I'd put on, these clumps of They look kind of like moss. I went with just a very bright green and then desaturated it with some neutral gray. Later on, there will be things that will kind of tone it down, but I wanted to have that bright green showing so that it made sure that there was going to be the notion that this is green. This is something distinct, something growing, something alive. If you've ever walked around in a swampy area, you know there's a lot of bright greens generally in those areas. A lot of browns, a lot of grays, a lot of greens. And so I wanted to really make sure to sell that notion. To add a few highlights to the brown areas, I used some a lighter tan color to just bring out some of that texture. I didn't want it to sell as sand, but more as it's going to be kind of a swampy area. And then I put a lighter green over the vegetation parts of the figures. This is, you can call this moss, you can call this bushes, it's whatever you want it to be, I think. For the wood, I did some texturing with a mix of the wood color and neutral gray, just to give it a little bit of a bark look, some highlights. I did some stippling. At times I did some things that were more like dry brushing. I just basically tried to build up texture around the various pieces of wood that they had there, because I wanted these to look like they were, fallen down trees, not trees that were growing. And then I wanted to do these little tendrils that hung down. They kind of reminded me of the Spanish moss that I saw on trees growing up in North Florida and South Georgia, where I lived many years ago. So I thought I would just kind of nod to that, and I painted them a very light gray, kind of like Spanish moss. And then on the groundwork, I used Vallejo dark green model wash to just heavily paint that in there, to deepen the shadows, to give it kind of a dank, musty look. Like, if you've ever been around in a swamp, you know what I'm talking about. If I got a little up on the trees, that's fine. It looks like mold and mildew. It's just going to sell the notion that this is, hopefully, sell the notion that this is a wet area, a very swampy area. I used a dark gray model wash and just a little bit of the same dark green wash to go over the tree. Again, not only wanting to bring in some shadows, but also to just sell the notion that this is something that's sitting out in a very wet area, under a lot of cover, and so there's going to be a lot of moss and mildew growing on it, and just hopefully making it look really swampy. Well, I think I'm going to call this project finished. Obviously, I did a little more work off camera, just touching up details after I got the bases painted. I went around, I put a little lead belcher on all the silver parts, touched up a few areas with additional washes and shades and maybe a few highlights, not doing anything different than I'd done before, just touching up. I did add, and I just frankly forgot to film this, I did add some weathering in the lower part of the capes, just using some Vallejo model wash. I think it was dark earth or brown earth or something like that, but just something, and it doesn't have to be a Vallejo model wash, just anything to give a little bit of a dirty look around the bottoms of the capes and on the boots, because they would obviously get dirty. Whoops. And so that's what I did to finish this off. It's been a learning process. I've not painted minis to great extent before. I've painted a few that were part of other models, but I've never just exclusively sat down and painted a mini, and especially painted one for a video, and on top of that done an entire squad. I'm pretty happy with the results. Certainly there's a lot of room for improvement on the work that I do, but I'm pretty happy with the results. As I noted earlier, I wasn't real happy with the flesh tones. Otherwise, I think it's about where I would expect myself to be, having not done this to a great extent before. And I will say I did have a lot of fun, and that's the key. I'm certainly not planning on shifting to painting nothing but minis, but I'm going to be doing a few more of them along the way. I've actually got Star Wars Legion mini primed up and ready to go, and hopefully have him out before too long. But it won't be, you know, I'm going to continue doing other things like I've always done. But I think there's a benefit in painting minis specifically because of the benefits it gives you in terms of growth. If you've not painted them before, and I'm speaking from the little bit of experience I have painting minis and this experience, if you've not painted them before, it really stretches your skill set in ways that other types of modeling may not, because the details are so very small, and it requires blending and, you know, working on gradients and handling colors in a way that aren't necessarily part of other modeling tasks. So I think it's a benefit in and of itself, even if you never play a game, even if you're, you know, not into the tabletop gaming, which I'm not. I don't play. These are probably I may put them up for auction on eBay. I may just set them on my shelf. But I think the fun that I had painting them was worth it, and two, I think the benefit in terms of how it stretched my skill set is worth it and worth doing again. So I would highly recommend, if you don't paint these, pick up a few and see what you think of them, and paint them up and see how they stretch you. Well, thank you so much for watching this video. I'm especially grateful if you're still hanging around at this point. I know it's a small crowd that hangs around to the very end, so thank you very much. If you're still here, I appreciate that. There are, of course, links down below for the social media and for my website. There is a link down over here for the subscribe button, and if you would hit that and hit the little bell icon, I would appreciate it. I'd also be grateful if you drop a comment down below and maybe leave this video a like. That'll just help me out with the channel, and I would be most grateful for that. There's a link down below to Patreon, so if you'd like to support the work that I do, please do so. And if you're already a Patreon supporter, thank you so much. It's your support that makes my work possible. I just couldn't afford to do it, as I've said before, at the pace that I do it, with the materials and the kits and all of that I do. Without you, we just couldn't afford it. So thank you very much, patrons, for your support. And with all that being said, I'll leave you with one final thought, as I always like to do. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.